Tonight, again, Chris Evans is joining us. He's a forestry extension and research specialist, and he's coming to us, I think, from Southern Illinois, I assume. He's based at the Dixon Springs Ag Center, specializes in forest management, restoration, invasive species, forest health, and native plants. Pretty much everything. He's amazing. He's an encyclopedia of anything about the natural world. His topic tonight, especially relevant to you as master naturalists are working probably on sites doing stewardship with invasive species during this season. He's going to cover the basic mechanical, cultural, chemical techniques that you will probably use or you can use during the fall and the winter seasons in controlling invasive shrubs, trees, woody vines. And then we're going to discuss a little bit about the tools and equipment options available for control efforts. So that's a little bit of a synopsis of what Chris is going to cover this evening. So with that, then I think I'll turn it over to you, Chris, and you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate it. Um, yeah, I'm excited about this. So one of the neat things is, yes, I'm at the Dixon Springs Ag Center down here in Pope County. And if you see the picture kind of behind my video, that is Millstone Bluff, which is so nice because I can see it from my office window. And if you've never seen that, it's a little kind of isolated hill that has a Native American stone fort on the top of it and a lot of other kind of archaeological interest there. So it's a neat place down here. If you never visited, you should certainly check out Pope County. But yeah, as Amy said, I'm going to talk about controlling woody invasive species in the fall and winter. And really what I wanted to do, and I thought for a while about this talk, and I know that you all have heard more than likely heard me give a lot of different invasive species talks. So I kind of wanted to move beyond the basics a little bit and not just kind of rehash the same exact talk and these. So I thought about it and I came up with a few assumptions that I'm working with, assumptions about you all, the audience. And so the first assumption here is pretty much I'd imagine everyone that's on this webinar knows the definition of an invasive, so we don't have to worry about that. Pretty much everyone here agrees that we need to control invasive species. That's an important part of stewardship. But I'm also assuming that not everyone is familiar with the basics of invasive species control, some of those different techniques that we can use. So I'm going to go over those. And then lastly, we're talking about woody plants. And so I'm assuming everyone here knows the definition of what a woody plant is, right? So I'm working with these. I don't have to kind of cover these basics in the talk and then just going to move forward. Now, if you're somebody that wants to know these basics and you really want to get more of that information and more detail about the kind of background about invasive species and background about invasive species control, we have a lot of options out there for you. And so this QR code and this URL goes to our YouTube channel, the Extension Forestry YouTube channel, where we have a lot of videos on invasive species. And so you can see here, there's just three I've highlighted. We have one that goes into detail on individual plant treatments to control woodies. We have a great video on basic control techniques of woody invasive plants out in the field where you can see them happening. That one has a distinction of being our most viewed video on our YouTube channel. And we have some basics of invasive species ecology through an introduction. So feel free to grab the URL or just take a picture of the QR code if you want to kind of go back after this and kind of view some of these more basic talks. But I'm going to start with something a little fun. Since I know you all are pretty familiar with these, I'm going to do a name these woody invasives, right? So feel free to put your answers into the chat, and we're just going to name a few of these that I'm sure that many of you are familiar with. So the first one up is this plant, more of an open plant. It likes open habitats, disturbed areas, forest edges. So if you know this plant or want to give it a guess, feel free to throw it there in the chat and we'll see what people think. Nobody guessing. right, I'll give it a couple more seconds. So Ruth guesses honeysuckle. Camille guesses autumn olive. Pat agrees with autumn olive. All right, looks like autumn olive is winning pokeweed. That's a good guess too. Um, so the majority's getting it right. This is indeed autumn olive. And so, yeah, there's definitely autumn olive is more of a southern Illinois plant. Doesn't necessarily grow all the way up into northern Illinois, but is one of the big woody invasives we see kind of invading open lands and forest edges. All right, number two. This one is definitely found in every county in the state, and the bright red berries are very visible right now. This picture was just taken a couple days ago. All right, a lot of things coming in. Honeysuckle, 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 honeysuckle. You are absolutely correct. This is Amur honeysuckle. You can also call it bush honeysuckle. There's actually a few different species of bush honeysuckle that all occur in Illinois. This is the most common one. All right, getting a little bit harder. What about this one? Pay attention to the stem and how those weird wingings on it. So what do you think this one is? Winged euonymus, burning bush, burning mix. Oh, this was super easy. You all got this one faster than I thought. Yes, indeed. It is burning bush, also called winged euonymus. All right. One that people should be pretty familiar with. Those funny fruits with the single seed on in the middle, and then the wings on either side, and um, the long leaves. Ailanthus, tree of heaven, tree of heaven, ailanthus. I like that people are using the scientific name. Nice. Yep. This one, you can just look at that picture and almost smell the rotten peanut butter smell, right? This is indeed tree of heaven. All right, couple more. What about this vine? I see it twisting and wrapping and climbing up trees. It's a light colored vine with little diamond lenticels. You may be less familiar with this one. It is kind of spotty across the state. We see bittersweet, bittersweet, celastrus. All right. You are getting this is indeed bittersweet. So it goes by a couple different names. It could be called Oriental bittersweet or roundleaf bittersweet. I typically call it roundleaf bittersweet, but same species there. All right. This one's a little bit harder. You may be less familiar with this one, although it is widely used as an ornamental. All right, Kathy got it right away before I was even finished talking about it. Everybody's getting it. Wow. So barberry. Yep. So Japanese barberry, one that's certainly kind of on the rise in the state. And then I think the last one is this one. So not a new invader, but one that's certainly getting more attention these days. So this is a tree. So what are your thoughts on this species? All right, Katie started out with pear, Mike, Callery pear, pear. Ooh, Linda guessed buckthorn, which is a good guess, but the majority is getting it right here. This is Callery pear. Some people may know it as Bradford pear, but it is certainly very widespread across the state. And if you go around in early spring, February in southern Illinois or March in northern Illinois, and you see white flowering trees in our roadsides, you're almost guaranteed to be looking at Callery pear. All right. Thank you all for playing along. I was happy to see how knowledgeable you all are about some of the woody invasives. All right, so let's move then into the actual presentation. And since I'm assuming that not everybody's familiar with some of the management techniques, I'm going to spend a few minutes kind of going over some of those basic techniques that you all and all of us would use to control invasive woody plants. So these are just some general kind of basic covering the ground of what are some of the control techniques. I like to show my son Silas here. He's my youngest son, and he's happily pulling some honeysuckle out. But we'll start right at the beginning with some of the easiest things, which is simply hand pulling. You got no tools other than gloves. And so this is something that can be used with smaller woody invasives or woody invasive vines in some cases. And it's a good, it's a good option for volunteer days. It's a good option for, again, for those smaller situations. This, you might guess, is quite an older picture. You see, I'm over there on the left with a very black beard, which I haven't had a very black beard in a very long time. Another way to tell it's old is those two little kids on the left of the picture. The little girl looking at us in the blue Crocs. That is my daughter, who is now married and going to chiropractic school. And the little tyke standing beside her in the red shirt is my older son, who is now in college and is 6'2". So you can tell this picture was taken a long time ago. But hand pulling, the things you want to think about is to get the entire root system. If you leave some of that, you might get some regrowth. That can be difficult in dry soil conditions. You may want to pile or remove the plants if seeds are present, and you may get some regrowth or more germination. So even if you do hand pull, you're gonna have to follow up, right? So again, good for small plants, small root systems. The next level up of kind of non-chemical control is mechanical pulling aids. You may call them weed wrenches, but there's a lot of different names out there. And this is basically the same as hand pulling. It just gives you a mechanical leverage or mechanical advantage. And I love the funny names of these. There's uprooters and extractigators and polar bears. There's a bunch of different ones, but they all kind of serve the same purpose, basically. It allows you to pull plants out of the ground that otherwise would take too much force for hand pulling. You have some kind of claw at the base that you can wrap around the base of the plant, and then a long handle to give you mechanical advantage so you can lever that plant right out of the ground. Same thing applies. You're disturbing the soil. You may make sure you get the root system, but it does work for a lot of kind of medium-sized to small woody invasive plants. Moving out of those kind of mechanical, non-chemical options, we're going to talk about a few of the control techniques that we use herbicides for, so chemical options. And before I talk about herbicides, I always want to just preface that with saying that you make sure that you always use your appropriate protective gear that's specified by your label. Oftentimes, those personal protective equipment or PPE that is required on that label is going to be something like eye protection, long sleeves and pants, closed-toed shoes, and chemical gloves. They varies a little bit depending on the herbicide you use, but that's kind of the typical PPE that's listed. And then, of course, you always want to read and follow your label information. It's the law. So the first technique would be a simple foliar spray. And a foliar spray is when it's just as it sounds. You're spraying the leaves of the plant and letting the leaves take up the herbicide, systemic herbicide, into the plant, and then go into the plant that way and work to kill the plant. And the nice thing about foliar applications is you're using dilute solutions of herbicide. They're often 1 to 2% herbicide mixed with water, so it's very dilute, which is nice. And when you're using foliar treatments, it's important to get thorough coverage on the leaves. You want to try to treat all the leaves fairly well, but not so heavy that you're getting drips and runoff. The foliage on those plants should be green and actively growing for them to best take up the herbicide. And then you also, since you're spraying it over an entire plant, you want to watch for non-target impacts due to overspray. And there's a lot of other things to go with this. This is just a real basic overview. Next would be a cut stump. So cut stump is one of my favorite techniques for controlling woody invasive plants, and it's basically just as it sounds. You're cutting the plant off close to the ground, and you're treating that stump with a systemic herbicide to allow it to kill the root systems and prevent any sprouting. Couple things to mention with cut stump. In general, water-based solutions are the most effective techniques to use, more so than oil-based. But they're really effective summer and fall, and then you can use them in the winter if it's above freezing. Oil solutions are something you typically switch to in the winter months. You want to treat the entire surface of those cut stumps If it's less than 2 inches in diameter, or if it's bigger, you only have to really treat that outer 1 inch of the larger stems. And I really like using an herbicide dye because it helps me track what I've treated and what I haven't. But again, very, very common technique. We'll get into more detail a little later. Basil bark. So basil bark is where you use, it's kind of like cut stump, but you don't cut the plant down. You're going to use an oil-based and ester herbicide, and you're going to apply the herbicide right to the bark and let it penetrate through there. So this is, you'd want to treat all the stems. If it's a multi-stem tree, you want to get from the ground up to 12 to 14 inches high. It does use a little more herbicide than cut stump, but it doesn't require cutting those plants down. So just another technique. And then the last of the techniques I'll mention are kind of three in one, these stem injection applications. So when I say stem injection, I'm talking about all of these, the girdle, the hack and squirt, and the drill treatments. They all involve the same thing, as which you're making a damage point onto the stem of that woody plant and applying concentrated herbicide right into that damage point. So this reduces the need for the herbicide to be taken up through the bark. So it's kind of halfway in between basil bark and cut stump. And so again, so one of them is called girdle and a girdle cut or a frill cut. That's where you cut completely around the stem of the woody plant deep enough to expose the inner bark and the sapwood, and then you directly spray into that cut. It's important to make sure that cut goes all the way around the plant and clearly around. You don't have a skip, and it cuts deep enough to go past the bark, so you can actually get this into that, cambium and the phloem layer, which is where you want that herbicide to be applied. Hack and squirt is where it's similar to girdle, but you don't cut all the way around. You just do a series of chops with a hatchet or a machete to expose that inner bark and that phloem layer, and then you apply the herbicide right into that wound site. So this works well because it's fast and it doesn't require a lot of equipment. It requires just a hand spray bottle and a hatchet or some other kind of cutting technique, and you can really control bigger invasive plants. Here is a colleague of mine, Zach, putting some hacks into a Paulownia or princess tree, which is a problematic invasive in southern Illinois, and then I followed up with some herbicide treatments. We do this a lot, and we're moving actually more to drill and fill. So it's the same exact concept as hack and squirt, but instead of using a hatchet, we're using a cordless drill. So we're drilling at a downward angle with a 3/8 to a ½ inch drill bit, 1.5 to 2 inches deep into the wood, and then applying the herbicide into each of those holes. And now the amount you apply and the number of chops kind of depends on each the label and the herbicide you use, but it's very, very fast, requires little herbicide, and doesn't has very little chance of kind of non-target impacts because you're applying it just right directly to that stem. So it works really well. And if you're unfamiliar with stem treatments, you can expect about 80+% mortality after 2 years, which is not too bad. Most treatments, you're creeping up there closer to 95% or so mortality, but it is a little slower acting than a lot of the other techniques. And so one recent study found after 1 year, we had 66% mortality. We followed up the next year and it was crept up to 83% mortality. So 8 out of every 10 trees we treated died. And some of those other ones were looking pretty bad. So I'd imagine if we looked at 3 years, it actually would have bumped up closer to 90 or more percent mortality. But you have to be patient because it takes a little while for this treatment, these stem treatments to work. So again, that was like super fast, right? I just wanted to kind of cover those to cover the bases before we kind of get into the fall and winter stuff. But I also am very interested in learning from you all. So I wanted to do a poll. And so I'm going to launch a poll and ask you all which of these different methods I just talked about have you used in the past? Because I'm kind of interested in seeing your experience. So you can name or put in um, any of those. So choose all that apply. So I'll give you a minute or two to hop on there, and hopefully you're seeing that poll and you can enter in which ones that you have tried in the past. All right, I see people answering, which is awesome. All right, people are still answering, so I'll give another 30 seconds, 40 seconds or so for people to answer. All right, last 10 seconds here. I'm going to close the poll and share the results with you all. All right, I'm not seeing any new answers, so here we go. All right, so hopefully you can see the results here. So the vast majority, almost everybody has conducted some hand pulling. Almost 50% of you have done mechanical pulling aids, weed wrenches, and foliar spray. A lot of people have done the cut stump, and then much less have done basal bark or stem injections. So, all right, thank you very much. It's nice to see where you all have experience in and what kind of techniques. All right, so let's move into the real topic of the night, which is what is unique about controlling invasive woody plants in the fall and winter. And so I'm going to go over these and then spend most of the rest of the talk kind of going into more detail on these. So the first is simply that plants are starting to shut down or are going dormant, right? And so that's very different than spring and summer. Now, this is both our invasive plants and our native plants, and we'll come back to this in detail later, but that's one of the topics that makes control unique in fall and winter is these plants are starting to shut down or they're already shut down. The kind of second point would be that most invasive plants have already produced viable fruit by that time of year. By fall, most fruit are on the plant and are ripe or getting close to ripening, and by winter, they're certainly ripe, right? And so that creates a little bit of a situation that we need to consider when we're controlling. Winter and fall gives us possibility of freezing temperatures and the possibility of snow cover, and that's going to change what we can and can't do or what are some of our options and our choices are. So we'll get into that too. And then the last one, animal nesting is generally over, right? So we don't have birds nesting. Most of our reptiles and amphibians are hibernating, particularly late fall into winter. Early fall is a little different, but just know that that's happening in our natural lands where we're working, and that's going to give us some options of things we can and can't do. All right, so let's go into these more into detail. All right, the first, plants are shutting down and or are dormant. All right, so this can limit the use of foliar applications of herbicide when the foliage is turning, colors are already dropped, and a lot of these invasives have an extended leaf phenology or are semi-evergreen, and so that allows us to give some selectivity for our control, right? So we'll go into those next here. All right, so talking about limiting the use of foliar applications. When I talked about foliar before, those leaves, you don't necessarily care about killing those leaves. Those leaves, when you're doing a foliar application, are just the vehicle for getting the herbicide into the plant. And so you need those leaves to be green, actively growing, photosynthesizing. And so here we have bush honeysuckle and amber honeysuckle in kind of four states that we see it in the fall. So we have bright green on the left, we have yellowing, fall color, and then completely gone, right? So if you're looking at foliar treatments, that first condition, all the way on the left, those dark green leaves, that's prime, right? So that plant is ready to take up herbicide. It's going to be susceptible to foliar treatments. All the rest of those are not, right? And so when you're doing foliar treatments in the fall, you have to make sure that your plants are in the right leaf condition so that your treatments are effective. If you are going out and your honeysuckle looks like this picture, where it's kind of yellowing and the foliage is thinning. This is what I would call past it, and it's not suitable for foliar application. It's not going to be an option anymore for the plants that you're controlling. Those leaves are falling off. They're starting that abscission layer where they're starting to separate from the stems, and they're not transporting nutrients and not transporting energy back into the plant anymore. They're just basically in the process of falling off. So you could spray this at this point and you would not have good control. Same thing with this roundleaf bittersweet here. You can see it's already got that lightened color, and it's not going to be conducive to foliar spray. So when you're treating in the fall, pay close attention to that leaf condition, right? Make sure that it's in good condition and it's susceptible before you decide to do a foliar spray. Kind of on the flip side, and what's nice for some of our invasives is a lot of times they keep that condition, that foliar spray is a good option way into the fall, and sometimes in southern Illinois, even well into early winter. So a lot of these plants have what we call an extended leaf phenology, where they leaf out a little earlier in the spring, but in the fall they stay green later, longer than a lot of our native species out there. And so usually in early November, you can go out in the woods and the only green plants are often are going to be invasive species, right? So we see honeysuckle here with nothing else really green. This picture was just taken a couple days ago here in southern Illinois. If you look beyond the honeysuckle, I'm here. I crawled underneath of the honeysuckle to get this picture. You can see a lot of the trees. In this case, they happen to be tulip trees. The leaves are already thinning and going, and then the honeysuckle's bright green, right? So it has this longer staying capacity, as does many others. This happens to be autumn olive. And so, as long as those leaves are in good condition, you can treat these plants in the fall and get some selectivity. If your native plants and other plants are dormant, at this point in time, they're not going to readily take up that herbicide. And so, by spraying and treating things, you can have kind of a directed application where you're only impacting those invasive species by timing it just right into the fall with this extended leaf phenology. Now, not all invasives have this. And so here's the common ones, right, that have somewhat of an extended leaf phenology would be the exotic bush honeysuckles, common buckthorn, glossy buckthorn somewhat, autumn olive, and Callery pear to some degree have kind of extended leaf phenologies that stay green longer. And then we have a handful of other woody invasives that have kind of a semi-evergreen or even sometimes an evergreen nature, which they'll keep green leaves throughout the entire year. Winter creeper is the common one. It's green pretty much year long. English ivy is as well. Vinca is not really a woody plant. It's kind of a semi-woody vine that grows along the ground, but it does stay green very long. And then honeysuckle and privets, Japanese honeysuckle, which is the viney one, and privets um, are stay green so long. I call them kind of semi-evergreen, which you can usually find some green leaves on them almost every month of the year, even though they technically are deciduous. It's really close to evergreen. So all of these you can consider kind of treating in this late fall time period and to get some selectivity, and it gives us an advantage, right? And so this is a neat picture of an aerial shot, and this was taken in November. I think it was November 8th, quite a few years ago now. But pretty much everything green in this picture is an invasive. You can see a lot in there, and so a lot of people are moving to kind of aerial control techniques. And I know that's not necessarily something that you're going to be doing as a master naturalist, but I like to make you familiar with it. Where if the foliage on the trees are already down and gone, they're actually treating honeysuckle kind of through the foliage with drones or something like that, and having some good success. And so this is an option for folks that have very heavy, dense infestations of a size that it's really hard to tackle in any other way. Again, I don't expect you all to be doing drone applications. I just wanted to make you aware of it. And so situations like this were very dense stands of one of these extended leaf phenology invasives, even under a canopy. You can use aerial control kind of for an initial treatment, knock it back, and then it's at a lower infestation level where you can come in with other techniques. So it's certainly an option out there for for landowners, just to make you familiar with it. All right, so that's kind of plants are going dormant or are dormant. Kind of the next point we have is that most invasive plants have already produced viable fruit that year. And so the reason I put that in here for this talk is just that you want to make sure that you're taking measures not to spread those seeds via your control work. When you're controlling invasive species, what you don't want to do is kind of aid in spreading those things around. And so that's going to be equipment cleaning, monitoring sites where you've done work or monitoring sites where you've left after you've done work just to see if there's any, um, new invasives popping up in the year after, and then maybe piling invasives, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So there's definitely some things that you can do to kind of limit the spread of these invasives. And just understand that different woody invasive plants have very different ranges of seed bank longevity or how long their seeds live in the soil. Most of them aren't very long, right? 2 years, 1 years, maybe 3 or 4 years. But a few like multiflora rose and Sericea lespedeza can have very long seed banks that live in the soil. So spreading those seeds around could certainly, lead to kind of years of work or at least monitoring you got to watch. So what can you do about this if you're working in the fall when seeds are on the plant? The big thing is clean equipment after you're working in invaded areas. If you're in there mowing or brush hogging or something like that, spraying those off, blowing those off, cleaning that equipment is very, very important. So you're not moving those invasives around. You're not spreading them accidentally. Be careful what you bring in and out of the woods as well. And then it's not this time of year, it's not only the woody invasives, but if you're doing work, even controlling woody invasives, you have to consider some of the herbaceous invasives that are in the area. And some of those are very easily spread, um, you know, by hitchhiking on your clothes or in mud on your shoes. So you definitely don't want to be spreading herbaceous invaders out there, which are in seed this time of year while you're doing woody invasive control work. And so this is Japanese chaff flower, which is a big problem in the southern third of the state, but it's being found farther north. It's actually been found all the way into Canada now, so it's certainly a concern for the entire state. But you can see those little barbs on the fruit on the left can easily grab hold of you and take a ride. So that's my coat, the cuff of one of the sleeves on my coat, and you can see those chaff flower seeds just hanging right on, right? So there's a number of these herbaceous invaders that can be easily spread via equipment and clothing. Chaff flower, as we mentioned, stilt grass can certainly get into the mud on your shoes or fall down into the cuffs on your pants. Same thing with garlic mustard. Teasel, hedge parsley, Sericea lespedeza, Johnson grass, kind of any of these, plus others, can easily be picked up and moved around. So anytime you're working in areas out in the field in this time of year when seeds are present, spend a little time cleaning your shoes off, getting the mud out of the tread of your shoes, brushing your pants off just to make sure that you don't have any hitchhikers on there. Uh, Turning down the cuffs on your pants in case your pants are cuffed, just to get the duff and stuff that falls in there if you're walking through things, because that can certainly hold a lot of seeds. So just some simple things there. And then also just monitoring the area that you control, you've done any control work, in the year after to look for and identify new seedlings. As you're cutting these plants down or something, you may be knocking seeds off. They may be getting dragged around a little bit. And so just know that you may see kind of a flush of seedlings the year after, or even a couple years after your control work. So kind of plan that in to come in and monitor those, look for those sites just to make sure that you're not releasing a new cohort of seedlings with your control work. And then some folks kind of help combat this. They make piles of their invasive species. If they're doing work in an area, especially cut stump work, they'll pile all of the woody slash after doing their cuts into one pile or a series of smaller piles. for a couple reasons. One, it helps with access and movement through the site. It allows you to burn those piles maybe later in the year, but it also concentrates a lot of those seeds into these piles. So you have an area where most of those seedlings the next year may be, and that helps you control them. So that's just one idea that some folks kind of utilize. All right, moving along to the next one would be the possibility of freezing temperatures and snow covers, certainly in the winter, maybe even in late fall. And this does impact our herbicide choice, right? There's certain things that work in freezing temperatures and certain things that don't. And it can limit some of our applications, particularly the use of basal bark. So I'll just jump into that here. So foliar applications, they typically need, again, active foliage that is actively photosynthesizing. So anytime the air temperatures in the day are dropping below or staying below, I should say, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, um, that's going to limit the effectiveness of those foliar applications. Even if your foliage is green, dark, looks great, if it's too cold, it's not getting up above that 50-degree mark for an extended period of time in the day, you might not have good success with that control technique. So pay attention to the temperature, especially how long the temperature is going to remain at its high point in the middle of the day, and make sure that it's above that 50-degree cutoff if you're planning to use foliar applications. And then again, we mentioned earlier when I talked about cut stump that water-based herbicides are typically the best option for doing cut stump treatments. The stumps tend to take them up really well, draw them in, so we typically have better success using a water-based herbicide. But you're not going to be able to use those if it's below freezing. Not only will it freeze up your applicator, your sprayer, but it also just limits the uptake onto the plant itself. So if temperatures are going to be below freezing, if you're using cut stump, you have to switch to an oil-based herbicide that's not going to freeze in those cold temperatures. Now, there's a little bit of things you have to kind of change and think about when you're doing water-based versus oil-based herbicides. So if you're using a water-based herbicide to do a cut stump, again, you want to treat that entire cut surface and if it's small, or the outer 1 inch for larger stems. For an oil-based herbicide, you want to do that. In addition, you want to apply that oil heavy enough that it starts to run down the outer bark. So you're basically doing like a little basal bark treatment right below the cut stump. And so it uses more herbicide, but we find that tends to be more effective at getting the control you want when you're using an oil-based herbicide for a cut stump, is putting on more herbicide, letting it run down the bark a little ways. Kind of a common thing we all talk about when we say do a cut stump treatment is you need to treat within 10 to 15 minutes of cutting for it to be most effective. That is certainly true, especially with water-based herbicides. When you switch to oil-based herbicides, since you're kind of almost doing a basal bark treatment as well, we have a longer window. And so typically we say we want to treat within a day or two of that cutting treatment. So when you cut that plant down, you've got a little bit longer of a window to use an oil-based herbicide. I would still recommend treating it right away because you're not going to forget it and not be able to find it later. But just know that your window is a little broader when using an oil-based herbicide. The other thing about, potentially having snow is heavy snow cover really limits the effectiveness of basal bark treatment. So if you've got a lot of snow on the ground, even doing a basal bark treatment often is not effective. You just kind of want to wait for that snow to subside or melt a little bit before you can come in there and have better success. Wet bark is definitely not a good thing when you're trying to put an oil-based herbicide on there. And then similarly, not necessarily limited to fall and winter, but if you have areas that flood often and you get a lot of silt on those stems, that also limits the effectiveness, of basal bark treatments. All that being said, usually fall, if it's not in that freezing temperature, is an ideal time to do work on woody invasive plants, right? So these cut stump, basal bark, stem injections, even foliar spray when the foliage is in good condition are typically highly effective in the fall and often more effective in the fall than other times of the year. So I don't want to scare you away from these. This is the ideal time of the year to do these types of treatments, as long as the temperatures and the weather conditions are in that right. One thing, if you're looking at mid to late winter, is you want to consider sap flow. So if you're working on a plant that sap flows easily, comes out of it. One example would be if you're cutting maples out of an oak, an oak savanna or something like that. Sap flow, so warm days in late winter, can really, really limit the effectiveness of both cut stump and stem injection treatments. The sap flowing can literally push the herbicide right out of there, and you'll get less effectiveness. A great example of that would be some research we did looking at maple control out of an oak area when we're trying to do an oak restoration. So we did a bunch of different treatments, but if you pull all those treatments, when we treated the plants on a warm day when the sap was flowing, our combined mortality of all the treatments, everything we did to kill these plants after 2 years was 18%. So less than two out of every 10 plants we treated ended up dying. You can see in that picture there, that was a hack and squirt treatment. You can see right where the hatchet went. And then look at that callus tissue as we have a small dead area, but that plant's just growing right around that wound site. It did not kill this plant. Now compare that to the same exact treatments, the same methods, the same herbicides, but we treated earlier in the year at a time when the sap was not flowing. And the same treatments, the mortality after 2 years of all the different treatments combined was 83%, right? And some of our more effective treatments were 100% mortality. And so understanding plants that saps tend to flow in late winter. And if you see sap coming out of the plants as you're doing a cut stump or you're doing a hack and squirt or one of those stem injection treatments, just understand that that's drastically going to limit how effective your treatment's going to be. All right, so the last one of these points that are unique to fall and winter is animal nesting is generally over. Many reptiles and amphibians are hibernating. The reason I put this in here is that it provides opportunities for us to do some of these larger scale treatments in heavy infestations with a reduced impact to wildlife. Still take caution with doing these in early fall when some of the wildlife may still be out, but I just wanted to mention that to you. Again, I'm not expecting you all to do kind of these heavy treatments, but I'll mention them. But you certainly may be volunteering to help with prescribed fire. So prescribed fire is something we do in the spring and in the fall, and it's done often with one of the goals or objectives of the fire being to reduce the invasive species. Now, that being said, the results of doing fire and invasive species varies a lot, and it depends upon which invasive species you're trying to control, the timing and intensity of the fire. Are you doing repeated applications and are you doing anything kind of additional treatments, right? Typically, we use prescribed fire as a component of an integrated approach where we're controlling it along with other methods, but it can be highly effective at, again, reducing some of those invasive species. Now, if you are able to treat and do a fire kind of earlier in the fall, when these are still green and you're not as worried about, potential animal impacts, you can actually be very effective. So this is a shot here of what's called a kind of a growing season burn, an early fall burn when the honeysuckle was still green, and you can really see kind of how it impacted those. Um, Often honeysuckle or some of these woody plants are aggressive sprouters, so they're going to come back even after a fire. You can see here's two pictures following a couple years following a fire. You can see the dead stem in the middle on both of them, and you can see all the sprouts around them. So it may not get rid of your invasives, but it could certainly reduce their abundance, reduce their height, and make follow-up treatments a lot easier. Here's some of that Polonia that really came back after a fire. You can see some huge sprouts. It's just such a weird invasive. I like taking pictures of it. And so there's some invasives like stiltgrass, lespedeza, bittersweet, and tree of heaven we kind of call increasers, which means they tend to be promoted with fire, so that the infestations get worse, following a fire. And there's some that are decreasers, which means they tend to be reduced in population after a fire. So Japanese honeysuckle, bush honeysuckle, autumn olive tends to be reduced. You have smaller infestation size or smaller plant sizes following a fire. And there's others that have mixed results. And garlic mustard is definitely one of those where, depending on the timing, you may see more garlic mustard, you may see less. It's very varied, basically. All right, so I'm going to do another poll because I'm interested in your experience with prescribed fire. So I've got a couple questions. Specifically, do you have experience with prescribed fire? I'm really interested in knowing. And then, if so, what was kind of the results on invasives? So I'm going to launch that one. So these two questions, what is your fire experience? And then what was the response by invasive species you've seen with some of your fire? So if you have no fire experience, no problem. Feel free to put that in there. It's nice to kind of know the um, the audience. Right, everybody's answering, which is awesome. Right, I'll leave it up for just a little bit longer while folks are finishing up. Maybe another 10 seconds. Okay, I'm not seeing any new answers, so I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share the results. All right, so a lot of you have no experience with prescribed fire, which is totally fine. A number of you have limited experience, and a few of you have lots of experience with prescribed fire. So those of you that had some experience and answered, a few of you had no invasive species present on your burns, um, which is good, interesting. Some say you helped, and some had mixed results. Alrighty, good to go. Well, thank you so much. Let's move along to the next. Um, I'm trying to figure out how to, here we go, get rid of those drawings there. So another thing you can do with heavy problems in the fall, you can do something like forestry mulching. So this is where you're basically grinding down the invasive species. You're kind of starting over and then treating those sprouts afterwards. So just another option for you. So the problem with forestry mulching, it does heavy disturbance. So you would only do this on really heavy stands of invasive species. You might want to consider replanting afterwards and then certainly have a plan to treat those sprouts. So whether you're using forestry mulching or you're doing cut stump or anything, you're gonna have sprouts. Some of them are not gonna die. So when you're treating something that's sprouting, so it's a larger root system that's just kind of with some small sprouts coming out of it. Um, Make sure to pay attention to how big those sprouts are. If you treat them too early when they're really short and there's just a few leaves, you're not going to get enough herbicide take to actually kill those roots. So anytime that you're treating a sprout, I always say let those sprouts get to 18 to 24 inches tall before you're doing a foliar application. That gives them enough leaf area that you're going to get enough herbicide down in there to control that root system. All right, wrapping up here, one thing is the special consideration for woody invasive plants are clonal species. So black locust, tree of heaven, bittersweet, these are clonal species, which means they form large patches that are connected underground. These can really be a difficult group to control because if you damage the tissue, it often stimulates root suckering, and you can have just massive suckering and just really just an amazing response from it for the bad. So I tend to avoid any kind of technique that damages the tissue. So I don't mow them. I don't do cut stump treatment. So anytime you're dealing with one of these clonal species, use things like girdling or stem injections, basal bark or foliar control, because it kills that plant without doing that mechanical damage. So it's not sending that message to the plant that I'm being damaged. I need to sprout, right? And so that tends to be more effective. So I stay away from cut stumps for those. All right, I'm going to end with just a few resources. So Extension Forestry, we have a lot of publications, a lot of videos, as I mentioned earlier. Certainly, we're a good resource for this information, a good resource for asking questions. Extension now has their own invasive species page, and there's lots of great information on this page through Extension, where all of our publications on invasives, great pictures, great information on a bunch of different invasives. It's a really good resource. For the Midwest, we have the woody invasives of the Great Lakes. So it's just woodyinvasives.org. An amazing amount of information about woody invasive species and management on this website. If you haven't seen it, I would highly recommend going there. Good information on management in there. You can go to each individual species, get info on how to control them. Similarly, the Midwest Invasive Plant Network has a control database that you can go to. You just have to type the name of the species in there and it gives you lots of information about how to control them. So that's a great resource. And then the last resource I have is a video series from my colleague Stephen Enlow down at the University of Florida. And he is kind of the guru of woody invasive plant control. And so he has these very, very detailed, long series of videos on basil bark, cut stump, and hack and squirt. So if you want to know everything possible there is to know about those techniques in great detail, you can look at these management guides from the University of Florida, and they are absolutely just a treasure of information on these topics. And so I always like to highlight those because there's no place I think you can learn more about these individual plant treatments than from Dr. Enlow. And with that, again, as Amy said at the beginning, the next talk is November 11th about climate with Jess. Super excited about that. And with that, I'll happily take any questions that you all might have.
Okay, we have a few questions.
All right.
Number one, there was a couple questions about uh, drought. So what would be happening right now with the current kind of drought conditions that we're in when we're talking about controlling our woody species?
Sure. So drought is a stressor that often limits those plants' ability to photosynthesize. So they tend to shut down, they close their stoma, they may drop their leaves early, just like our native plants. And what that does basically is limit the foliar spray. So if your plants are in drought stress, they're starting to turn colors, you see those leaves drooping. That's a good indication that that foliar spray may not be effective, so you wouldn't want to use that. That's the big thing. Other than that, our basil bark or cut stump, those things should still be effective.
And I think you talked about this a little bit. Stem treatments, the preferable time of year to do stem treatments. I think you said maybe fall
So fall work,
slash early winter.
yes, so stem treatments typically, so stem injections like hack and squirt, all those pretty much work year round, with the exception of very late winter or early spring. They tend to be less effective. But other than that, you can pretty much use those year round.
Okay. Uh, Recommendation for the best herbicide for treating honeysuckle stumps at home.
So I like glyphosate-based herbicides, right? And so this would be Roundup, potentially, since that is kind of the common one, but there's lots of other generics out there as well, but it would have glyphosate in it. So something's happened in the last year or so that's really complicated things because now there's a lot of herbicides out there, particularly in kind of garden stores or big box stores, that are labeled as Roundup that are not glyphosate. There are other herbicides out there. So read that label to see what the actual ingredient is. And so that tends to be the best herbicide for doing a cut stump on honeysuckle that I found. Some of the other ones just tend to be a little less effective, but you could also use some of those like 2,4-D or triclopyr, but to me, glyphosate has been the most effective.
Okay, two questions, a little bit about debris after control. Um, One is what's the best way to get rid of some of that debris if you hand pull? I know we're talking a lot about woodies in this particular webinar, but the best way to get rid of those plants if you hand pull them or take them out by mechanical aid. That's one question.
Okay.
The second one was the mechanical forestry mulching. Is that debris? Someone asked if that debris was toxic or, had some kind of negative, uh, I guess, effect on the environment after
Sure.
it's mechanically mulched up.
Sure. So take the first one first. If you're hand pulling or you're using one of those weed wrench pulling aid things, um, you've got a lot of options. So we actually tested this here where we people often talk about worried about pulling something out of the ground, laying it on the ground and have it reroot. We tested that multiple ways where we actually tried to get it to reroot just by laying it on the ground. And it's very, very low. So that the chances are, at least for honeysuckle and burning bush, so I think you can pull them out of the ground and kind of disperse them throughout your woods. Just basically let them lay if you want. They're not going to really have much chance of rerooting. If you're worried about that, you can kind of tip them up and put the roots a little off the ground by stacking them on something else so they dry out. And then just let them rot if you want. And so that takes a little while. Most of these, particularly honeysuckles and things like that, they're really wood that decomposes quickly. So after a couple years, it's going to be pretty rotten. If you want more of an instant kind of clean look, you can certainly pile them into piles and let them rot like that, or make little animal piles, for wildlife, or consider doing small brush piles and brush fires and burning those piles kind of when it's safe to do so. The second question is about the forestry mulching.
Yeah.
I don't think it's toxic necessarily. I mean, maybe if you're doing like if you're mulching a bunch of black walnut or something, it may kind of impede a little bit of the other stuff that may grow there, with the juglone in it. The more bigger concern would be if you're mulching down really heavy infestations, sometimes that mulch on the ground piles up a little bit and it may actually be a little bit exclusionary for other things to grow in there. Um, Typically, I think that's not that bad of a thing because if it's that heavily infested with invasive species, the first things coming in are probably more invasives anyway. So it gives you a chance to kind of come back the next year, treat those sprouts that are definitely going to sprout, from the stumps after you did this mulching, and then let that decompose a little bit. You can come back and treat with or plant with something else following it.
Great, great. Well, it is 7 o'clock, so I think that's the last question that we have today. Thank you so much, Chris, for joining us this evening and